I'm Dana Shagru with CEAg World Greenhouse Produce, an innovative brand that engages with the rapidly expanding global greenhouse produce industry through a variety of platforms. Our mission is to educate and connect greenhouse produce growers and industry allies to help them better understand and sustainably advance the global food industry. On this episode of CEAg Talks, I'll be speaking with Carmen Azzaretti, Engineering and Operations Manager at Resource Innovation Institute. Carmen, welcome to CEAg Talks.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I'm really excited to be here.
We're happy to have you.
So operations, what's interesting here is that, again, this is number of individual places growing things. So especially when you see them stacked. And again, some of these operations might grow multiple things. So, if every single facility in Michigan, which has the greatest number of operations, is growing tomatoes and other fruits, vegetables and herbs, and fruits and berries, then it would technically be a little bit higher versus if another state has only specialized things. But this is a pretty good overview of like number of individual operations going on. That's pretty interesting. So it kind of goes from the top down: Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Washington, Wisconsin, California, and then it gets Kentucky, North Carolina, kind of keeps going. What's interesting here is that California is relatively far down, and then you have some states that don't tend to have like a ton of area, and we'll see that on the next chart, that are near the top. You have Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, and I think that Michigan just overtook New York recently, actually, in the most recent census. I think that New York was number one for number of operations before. So like growing, and this can be small farms though too. I mean, you do have to be a certain size, and in the beginning of the report it says exactly who gets surveyed, but it can be a smaller farm that is growing multiple products as well. So you have very different types of facilities. And I think that's one of those interesting things between this chart and the next one about area, because I think California has less facilities that are larger, or less operations that are much larger than a lot of these states that probably have a lot more operations that are a lot smaller. So yeah, if you put that number together, so you see kind of the trend of this chart, and then you can see here the California comes out here, which is, obviously very different. So California was pretty far down the line. It was still in the top 10, but it was not in the top 5 of number of operations, but here it's coming back up. What's interesting here though is Ohio, Texas, and then you kind of have New York, Kentucky, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and those ones were in there, but Texas also kind of pulls itself up here in area. And those, again, you're seeing more tomato area in most states, but you're seeing a ton of this other in California that I think is very indicative of the types of farms that are going on in California. And I'm sure someone in California can tell you exactly what this means in there. But I think when you're looking at all the states together, it's really interesting to see how those things divide up. Texas has that really significant fruits and berries there. North Carolina has that really significant fruits and berries there. Florida, you can see kind of right here, this green bar here. Florida hardly grows any tomatoes, but they grow a lot of those other fruits and berries that I think is really very interesting. So kind of as you go through the specific states and maybe you look at states that you can kind of see an interesting relationship between that area here. And then also if we go up again, those number of operations, which are a lot more even. Like this is a pretty like comfortable, low-key curve. Obviously you get down to like North Dakota and Delaware at the end that are really small, but like I think it's really interesting to see just how many like smaller farms are out there growing all sorts of food for all sorts of people. It really shows like this kind of powerhouse situation you got going on.
Absolutely.
So sales, relatively similar. You have California, Ohio, New York. Texas moved back, which is interesting, but Texas, it's mostly those tomato sales. If I put mushrooms on this chart, it's a totally different story. And so here we have all of the different greenhouse foods combined, and then we can talk about each individual kind of category. Obviously, other vegetables and herbs are not individuals. It's just kind of the group of them. And mushrooms has its own little series of pages. So we thought it was really important to like put it all together, but then also to kind of like slice it out. So for the public preview, people can see this kind of like national and then the state level data, not the sales though. And then they don't necessarily, I think we had tomatoes in there, but they don't necessarily get to see the specific crops in there, which is interesting. Here we've got operations that are growing this kind of ambiguous other category. So not including fruits and berries, not including tomatoes, but is including leafy greens, cucumbers, peppers, and fresh cut herbs, everything else that's being grown there. So you can see kind of this relatively consistent spread in operations. You've got Michigan, California, New York, Wisconsin, Washington, Ohio, Pennsylvania at the top there, kind of going down. A lot of, I would say, like the usual suspects, as we're saying, of those like common, these places have a lot of greenhouse facilities and operations. The growth, I think, is always a little bit interesting to see. This is that 10-year kind of thing. You got West Virginia with a 200% increase. You've got Tennessee with a big increase. You've got Kentucky with a big increase, which is interesting. So some pretty high increases. And then we have like the numbers for each of those kind of like top 5 states that are in there. So Wisconsin is a kind of an interesting one. Wisconsin does not come up in the top 5 very often, which is kind of cool. And then area. So again, we've got California blowing everyone out of the water. What's interesting is like Florida's kind of come up here. And Florida is #1 in floriculture in almost every category of floriculture. So I think California and Florida tend to have less operations with bigger facilities. And I think you really see that consistently. So it doesn't surprise me too much that Florida came up here because you probably have a couple of big food greenhouses down there. While in another state, those operations would be a lot smaller, just because I think in Florida and California, they're used to operating these really big greenhouses and that kind of scale. And they have all of the skills and all of the different, types of companies kind of in that area used to operating those really big greenhouses. And then gross in area, Kentucky. People talk about Kentucky and tomatoes recently, but this is over a 700% increase in area for other in 10 years, kind of coming out of nowhere with this Kentucky. And Kentucky is still not at the top here. They're not in the top 5, but that's a pretty big increase and checking that out. There's also Rhode Island, who's a little bitty, teeny tiny, but it seems like they're starting to grow, some of their own food there. There is a section of Rhode Island that does like more growing than, Rhode Island's not a very big place though. And then Alabama has this other like 300% increase, which is interesting. We do see a good amount of like Alabama food growing increases, which I think is great. I think states should be growing some of their own food. It's nice to have that like local, fresh kind of aspect. There's products that don't ship very well that can be grown really well in greenhouses as well. I think the products are very different depending on like how close someone is planning to sell something. And I think that CEA really enables the ability to have these locally grown products that maybe don't have an amazing shelf life or maybe don't have great shipping durability. But if you can be selling them within a relatively small area around the greenhouse, then you could have these really excellent products that are really lovely to have nearby. So